I'm Matt Elman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Greg Archer. Greg has been in English language teaching since 2010. He worked for 7 years in an international college, teaching Cambridge exam classes and managing the English language department. He's now a freelance author, teacher and teacher trainer, and is one of the authors of Complete Advanced.
Hello, I am Greg. This is my second podcast in this series, and today we're going to be thinking about developing receptive and productive skills. We're going to start by looking at improving listening. Then we're going to start thinking in slightly more detail about the exam and focusing a bit on reading and writing. And then we're going to look at this idea of spoken discourse. So here we are. We are in the middle section of the course. And I think now is really the time to start edging the teaching and learning towards understanding of the exam. As I said in the previous podcast, the first stage is all about making students more productive and practicing language. Well, now is a good time to start getting them a little bit more familiar with what's going to go on in the exam. It doesn't mean you stop eliciting and monitoring and creating opportunities to review the language and focus all your attention on what they'll be doing in the exam. You don't want to forget all the good work you've been doing so far, but they do need to start understanding a little bit better what they'll eventually be doing when it comes to exam day. I'm going to focus on all 4 skills here, so let's first of all think about improving listening. And the first thing to say is that this is a good time in the second stage of the course to get your students thinking about how they approach the different question types. In units 5 to 8, you're going to be covering all 4 parts of the listening test. Okay, so it's important to bear in mind the fact that that's what they're going to be doing, and you should be kind of getting them to understand how each part of the listening test differs from the others. Now, a good way of getting towards this are the exam advice boxes in the student's book. For example, on page 45, it talks about part 2. And the teacher's book also provides you with some excellent guidance for the classroom. So the advice box in the student's book will say you need to read each question to understand what the situation is and decide what you have to listen for. For example, a feeling or an opinion. And the teacher's book, which is there for you, suggests that you discuss the advice with students and ask them why they think it's useful. And the answer to that is that they will have a clearer idea of what they're listening out for. Re-elicit advice from previous units, okay? Don't forget the work that you've done previously, because all these exam parts 1, 2, 3 and 4, you've covered in the first 4 units of the course book. And it's also good to kind of draw connections between, look, we did this part 2 before. What do you remember from part 2 at that point? And start building up their knowledge of what each part of the exam involves. Now, if you haven't already done so, I would really recommend that you download a copy of the B1 Preliminary Teacher's Handbook, which you can get completely for free from the cambridgeenglish.org website. It gives you lots of tips for preparing your learners for the listening paper. And as I say, this is the stage of the course where we really want to start doing this. It gives you some excellent and valuable advice that is specific to each part of the exam. For example, it talks about part 2, the listening part 2, on page 40 of the handbook. And it tells you what the students need to do in class and what the candidates need to do in the exam. It says, during the first listening, candidates need to focus on gist understanding and choose the best option. Candidates should use the second listening to check the answer is correct. Now, this is extremely good advice for use in the exam. Try and get the answers correct on the first listen, and when you get the second listen, you are just checking your answers. And the handbook is packed with excellent advice like this. There is also the complete preliminary workbook, which you can use for homework. In Unit 5 on page 22, there is another Part 2 listening that they can use for practice. And one thing that you can do with them is certainly with the students who like a bit more of a challenge, is that you suggest that when they take it home and listen back, they play it at a slightly faster speed, say times 1.15. And they can do that on the app that they use to play the audio file. I also do this in class. If we do a listening practice in class, I will sometimes try and speed up the recording a little bit. Because when they come to listen to it for the second time, if you slow it down to the normal speed, i.e. the speed that they're going to hear in the exam, it often provides them with a little bit more reassurance. It provides them with a little bit more confidence that they've already tried it and got a few questions right at a faster speed. And then when they listen to it at the normal speed, it gives them that little bit of support. Because if they get the answers correct when the speakers are talking more quickly, that's fantastic. This is also the point to start thinking in more detail about what they're going to need to do in the exam in the reading section. And it's a good idea to get your students now to start thinking what their strengths and weaknesses are. Which parts of the reading exam do they feel more confident in doing? Because ultimately, when they get to the exam, they won't have to do the exam paper in chronological order. They won't have to start at part 1 and work through. It's good exam skills development to get them to think about, well, I want to get as many questions right as I can, so I'm going to actually start on part 3, and then I'm going to do part 4, for example. So by the time you've finished Unit 6 of Complete Preliminary, your students will by now have had the chance to look at all 6 parts of the reading. And it's a good time to go back over them all and get the students to start reflecting on which ones they currently feel more confident about, which ones they feel less confident about. If you can, maybe do a kind of a needs analysis or take notes of where each student feels at this point, because you can come back to that later as you get towards the end of the course and they can compare their development from now until then. And you can also tell them in Unit 7 you're going to look at Part 1 again. In Unit 8 you're going to look at Part 6. And as you cover these parts again, it allows the students to really take a bit more control of how confident they feel about each part of the exam. They can reflect a bit more on their strengths and weaknesses. It's also a good time in this middle section of the course to get students a little bit more aware of what the writing examiner will be looking for. Again, the teacher's handbook. On page 23, it says that the answers are assessed using the assessment scales, which consist of 4 subscales: content, communicative achievement, organisation, and language. Now, this is important for your students to get to understand that this is divided in this way now, because I've always found that my students, and particularly younger students, seem to have this idea that they have to go into the exam room and all they need to do is produce the best grammar and vocabulary that they are capable of, and they're going to come out with a high score. They're going to come out with an A. They're going to come out, when this is not necessarily how it works at all. Language, i.e. vocabulary and grammar, is only 25% of the overall mark. So if we can get them to understand what content and communicative achievement and organisation are, then that's going to be helping them. And we can do this by looking at existing texts. You could get them to read the text in Unit 5, page 51, for example, which is the story, which they might have to write for part 2 in the writing. And it's a story about Olivia reading a message from her friend. If we look at it, I would say to the students, is there any way that you could improve this piece of writing? And they can get the chance again to be productive and to upgrade the language. And I would direct them particularly to the last 2 lines, where it says in the last 2 lines, 3 hours later, Olivia was delighted when Ellie's flight had finally landed. Ellie said, "It's fantastic to see you," when she finally saw Olivia. Now, just listening to me there, you might have noticed it, but the students would hopefully notice as well that there's finally repeated in one line and in the next. So that's okay, but is there a way that we can avoid using repetition? Is there a way that we can avoid saying finally twice? Well, you could suggest something if they don't know that they might come up with eventually instead of finally. But what you're doing is getting them to understand that that's not just about vocabulary, eventually and finally. It's about text organisation and not repeating yourself. It's a different subscale. This is the time to start building that awareness. It's not just about how many words you know or how many, if your grammar is all completely correct. There's a lot more to it. And again, the Teacher's Handbook goes into a lot of detail about this, and I would heartily recommend it. So let's finally think about this idea of spoken discourse. Again, the handbook says here, some useful advice, candidates can also show their ability to organise their language using simple connectives. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is an important thing to think about. At B1 level, students aren't expected to produce anything too complex or to use higher level connectors such as with this in mind or looking at it from another perspective. But they are expected to develop what they're saying logically. So take your time to focus on this. Students, again, particularly younger students, can over-focus on showing off their language skills, but they need plenty of practice in responding to their partners when they get to the speaking test. It says as much in the exam advice box on page 58 in Unit 6. It says that students should keep the conversation going, for example, by saying, "Shall we talk about the ... And the important phrase for me here in this exam advice box is "for example." Keep the conversation going, for example, by saying. Well, that's just one example, isn't it? Think for a moment, how many other useful phrases can you think of in addition to "shall we talk about the ... Can you think about other phrases they can use? Can you divide these phrases into functions, like phrases for making a suggestion or phrases for coming to a decision? So it's all about kind of looking at your course book, looking at the Teacher's Handbook, thinking about what they're going to be coming to the exam and feeding this in, building into what you've already established as good habits of encouraging students to produce the language. Hopefully by now you've established those good habits with regard to eliciting and monitoring. And the ideal way, I think, to compile a bank of phrases for this type of speaking activity where we look at keeping the conversation going is to see what your students can provide. What can they produce, first of all? Don't necessarily just give them a whole page or a list of these phrases. Work with them. Work with your course book and work with them to produce the language, upgrade the language, correct the language, and practice the language. And another aspect to this with spoken discourse that gets assessed in the exam is interactive communication. So give them plenty of practice in taking turns. Keep that conversation going. Shall we talk about the ... If they say phrases like that, that's important for interactive communication. So all in all, that's what we're doing. We're building on good practice and we're moving towards awareness of the exam and what's going to happen on the big day.
Let's recap.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this second podcast. We've thought today about ideas for improving listening and why it's important to do that. We've started thinking a bit more in detail about the reading and writing exams and how we build awareness of that. And also spoken discourse, why it's important for things like turn taking, why the examiner is going to be listening out for those sort of things, and how important it is that your students start to understand what the exam is going to ask them to do and what the examiner is hoping to hear from them or read from them. Because after all, what we're trying to do here is we want to increase awareness of how to complete the exam task correctly. We want to develop control of language and skills. And you, the teacher, want to encourage student reflection, to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Thanks for listening.
That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/completeconfidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.